Hi, Steve here again. I have a really fun announcement today. As you know, the History of the Papacy and Beyond the Big Screen are now members of Scott Rank's and Salem Web Network's Parthenon Podcast Network. Today, I have a preview of an episode from fellow network member Professor James Early of the Key Battles of American History podcast. If you listen to either the History of the Papacy or Beyond the Big Screen podcast, you know James very well. He's an adjunct professor at Pasadena College in Texas, and he has been a guest on both of my shows many times. Key Battles of American History is James' podcast. He dives into the details of the most important battles in American history. Wars have played an important role in the development of the United States, and in this podcast, you find out how. James also runs the fantastic American History Fanatics group on Facebook. Find links to listen and subscribe to Key Battles of American History, the Parthenon podcast, and how to join the American History Fanatics Facebook group in the show notes. Now here's a snippet of one of James's shows on the rise of Imperial Japan. I hope you enjoy, and I will talk to you soon.
Hello and welcome to a brand new series of Key Battles of American History. I'm James Early, your host, as always. In this series, I will be discussing the Pacific theater of the Second World War through the lens of the most important battles fought in the theater. And I'm delighted to be joined by my longtime podcast partner, author, historian, professor, and host of the great podcast History Unplugged, Scott Rank. Dr. Scott Rank, it's so good to have you again. How you doing, Scott?
Doing all right. Ready to sink my teeth into the Pacific theater, if that analogy makes, or simile metaphor makes any sense.
You sound like a shark, Scott.
All right. That is a great point right there, which we're going to see those later on some battles. So things are getting grisly already, as they should with this war series.
We're starting right away. We're getting right into it. So before we really get rolling, I'd be interested to know, Scott, I know World War II has always kind of been one of your favorite topics, and you've read quite a bit about it. Tell me how you became interested in World War II naval history.
Well, yeah, it's kind of funny because I'm not a specialist in World War II at all. I'm a specialist in the late Ottoman Empire, which most people don't know about, so I try not to get into it too much because it doesn't have a common frame of reference with people. But most people who are interested in history are fascinated by World War II, and they should be because it's one of the cataclysmic, groundbreaking events that created our modern world order. But I'm not too big of a fan of researching it for the podcast just because, number one, I'm not a specialist, and there's many more people like you, James, who know more than I do. And number two, I think it just kind of distorts our view of war, where there's a clear good guy and a clear bad guy, especially in Europe when you have Hitler, the greatest war villain of all time. But a lot of wars aren't that cut and dry. But I am excited to get into this series with you because when I've looked at the naval theater in the Pacific, I mean, it really is fascinating where you're talking about the most tonnage in any war that ever happened, where there's millions and millions and millions of tonnage. There's dozens of aircraft carrying battleship and escort carriers and cruisers. And what really struck me is about a year ago, or about 6 months ago, I had a former Navy admiral on my podcast, and I was asking him, what was it like to be an admiral, where you're looking at your entire carrier fleet, where you're in charge of, you hold in your hand the lives of thousands and thousands and thousands of men. It's like being a pharaoh on top of a pyramid. And he said that up there, I mean, the wind blows the harshest at the highest altitude. You feel the weight of duty. And when I was asking him about who his favorite admiral was in all of history, he said Chester Nimitz, who was the leader of he was the fleet admiral of the U.S. Navy and commanded Allied air and land and sea forces. And I think what just made him stand in awe is because there's probably no one man who controlled as much naval might as he did. So, and people who are into naval history, they sort of talk in hushed tones about the Pacific theater the way that people in America talk about the Civil War, where it wasn't men clashing, it was gods, just this larger than life event. So yeah, I think this will be really cool to get into.
All right. By the way, I have to admit, or not admit, but I have to just bring up the fact that Chester Nimitz was a Texan.
All right.
And we will definitely delve into the lives, at least briefly, of many of the major figures. And also in this series, we'll not just look at the admirals and the generals, but we'll also look at the common sailor, the common soldier, just regular pilots, things like that. So we're going to look at it from high level as well as low level. I'll go ahead and talk about kind of my background with World War II just briefly. I'm also not a big World War II expert. I've always liked World War II. I've always found it fascinating. It's really kind of, in many ways, my favorite war to study, even though prior to this series, I hadn't really read tons of it. My specialty when I was in grad school was in Eastern European history, so totally different than the Pacific theater, at least. And it was early Eastern European history, so well before World War II. But when I started teaching American history at the college level 6 years ago, I started having to learn things like World War II, World War I, Revolutionary War, Mexican-American War, things like that. I've always been kind of a Civil War nut too. But I also have a personal connection to World War II and especially the Pacific Theater. And that is because my father fought in the Pacific Theater World War II. He was in the Marines. He was in a special unit called the Marine Raiders, or Carlson's Raiders, because his commander was named Evans Carlson. And I just feel like a personal connection. I feel like I'm in some ways tracing my father's steps. My father was a lot older than me. He was in his late 40s when I was born. He was born in 1919. I was born in 1968. So almost a 50-year difference between us. And unfortunately, he passed away when I was still a fairly young man. I guess I was about 36. He passed away in June of 2004, and he had Alzheimer's. So really, he hadn't been able to have regular conversations for several years prior to that. So I feel like I really lost him in the late 90s. And sadly, my father was like a lot of World War II veterans in that he just didn't talk about it much. My dad, I could probably count on two hands, maybe even one hand, the number of times that my dad actually told me specifics of the things that he did during the war. I know he was in the battles of Guadalcanal. He was at Tarawa. He was at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Obviously, those are all horrible, bloody battles. Those are all just Marine icons of battle, if you will. Those are epic things, kind of like Verdun for the French in World War II, World War I, I'm sorry, or the Somme, or the Battle of the Bulge for the Allies and the Germans in the Western Front. So I really felt like I'm in a way getting reacquainted with my father and his life, even though I'm not actually, fortunately, I'm not out there actually fighting it. But so I'm really dedicating this series to my dad, Colonel Cleland E. Early, United States Marine Corps. He served from 1941 to 1967 and reached the rank of full colonel. And he was a tough customer. He had to have been. Anyway, so this is for my dad, Colonel Early. And I'm really excited. I've really enjoyed doing the research for this. As we sit down to record this first episode, I've written most of the episodes by now. I still have a few to go at the end, but hopefully this will be good. Hopefully everybody will enjoy this. It's been a lot of fun doing all the reading and research, and I've done tons of reading and research, so hopefully it'll turn out okay. One other thing I want to do before we get started is I want to throw in the usual disclaimers that I do at the beginning of every series that Scott and I do. The first thing is this is really not going to be an in-depth, super detailed series. This is what I call a 10,000-foot view, or you can think of it as Pacific War 101. Now, we will get into detail in some of the battles, at least some level of detail, but we're not going to be able to cover every topic. We're not going to give full-length biographies of the major figures. We're not going to cover every single thing. There are other podcasts you can go to for that. Dan Carlin has a great World War II Pacific Theater series that's ongoing even now as we speak. There's the History of World War II podcast by Ray Harris. He goes into great detail. But we have purposely decided to try to limit this to no more than about, hopefully, 30 episodes of about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour each. I just didn't want to go into too much depth. I wanted to give this a finite end. I don't want it to be something where 5 years later we're on episode 500 and we've only done 2 years.
It truly could go on that long. It could go on infinitely long.
It really could. And so listeners, a lot of you will have questions like, well, why didn't you talk about this? Or what about this? Or what about this ship or this commander or this airplane? We've made a deliberate decision not to cover every single thing. So I hope that's okay. Hope you don't mind that. If you want more detail, check out the other podcasts I've mentioned. I know there's others as well. But wait till you finish this one. Finish ours first, okay? And then the other thing is pronunciation. Scott and I both get criticized sometimes for mispronouncing words. And I'm going to tell you, it is not easy when you're reading things and you come across a lot of names and places that are not English and you don't ever hear them. A lot of these things I've never heard. I've never heard it pronounced. So I try to make my best guess. I am not fluent in Japanese. Scott, are you fluent in Japanese?
It turns out I am not. I'm sorry to say. Not. Although the Karate Kid Part 2, part of it took place in Japan, so that was part of my exposure to Japanese culture.
Yeah. Well, I've studied a lot of karate, so I've learned some terms, and we're going to do the best we can. So please be patient with us. If we mess something up, don't turn us off. Give us a lot of chances. Give us a lot of grace, because it's not easy when we've struggled in the past with French terms. We've struggled with what else? German. What other languages?
I mean, listener,
Russian.
You sat with us through World War I. I'm sure James did a good job and was thorough. I probably made a number of mistakes, but you're still here. So
we're still here. You're still here.
You know what you're
getting. That's right. All right. So those are our disclaimers. Other than that, I don't have anything else. Anything else you want to say before we get going, Scott?
I think let's go. And I like your starting place. I won't steal your thunder. But the other thing, listeners, is kind of like World War I. I mean, you could start this. How far back do you really have to go? I mean, you could go back to 150 million years ago when the Pangean supercontinent split into many. So we get it. I mean, there's infinite context. We have to choose a starting point. So I like James's starting point.
Yeah. So we're going to start with how Japan rose to become a major power on the same level with the U.S. and with Britain and Russia and all that. So I'm just going to give a very brief overview, and we're going to start in the year 1868. The reason we're going to start in 1868 is because something happened that year, which is usually called the Meiji Restoration. This was an event in which the shogunate, in particular the Tokugawa shogunate, was overthrown, and the rule of the emperor was reestablished. Prior to this, the emperor had been basically just a figurehead, and Japan was ruled by shoguns, which are basically warlords. Again, you could have a whole series just on that, but let's let it go at that for now. So the rule of the emperor was reestablished. The political system was consolidated under the Emperor Meiji. And during the restoration, Japan also decided to rapidly industrialize, and they adopted many Western ideas and production methods. Japan also quickly and efficiently modernized and expanded its military forces. Later on, I'm going to give some statistics about just how stunningly rapid this industrialization and modernization of the military was. It's something that is hard to believe. We take it for granted since we already know about it, but people at the time were shocked how quickly they became on the same, pretty much almost the same level as the United States. They're going to, definitely militarily, they were superior to the United States in, say, the late 30s and early 40s. But they're going to have some of the finest pilots, the finest ships, the finest planes that the world had ever seen. And they're also going to gradually acquire a lot of new territories. If you're going to be a global empire, you need to have territories, right? That's part of being an empire. So there was the first Sino-Japanese War, which occurred in 1894 to 1895, which was an overwhelming Japanese victory. Japan crushed China in that war. And China ceded the island of Formosa, or today we would say Taiwan, also the Liaotung Peninsula, and the seaports of Port Arthur and Darien to Japan. Then, in the early 1900s, Japanese population expansion began to lead many Japanese to believe that territorial expansion was absolutely essential. They needed a place to put all these people. Let me quote from a journal that was published in 1902 called The Nation, Volume 74. I don't have the name of the author, but the author in this journal in 1902 wrote the following. This is a fairly long quote. I apologize for this, but it's definitely worth listening to. He said, with the old-time lack of self-control leading to universal early marriages, a problem is rolling up before which Japanese statesmen are appalled. At the present rate of increase, there will, before the middle of this century, be 100 million people to provide for. It is this prospect that is leading Japanese statesmen to make such frantic efforts to secure opportunity for colonization? Being practically shut off from going to other foreign countries, and Formosa being already largely occupied, Japan would naturally look to Korea and Manchuria. But of these places, Korea would afford only partial relief, both because of its limited area and of its present population. The northern region of Manchuria, however, is still almost as much in a state of nature as were the prairies of the Mississippi Valley when the Indians roamed freely over them. Okay, that's the end of the quote. So we see Japanese thinkers are starting to look greedily toward places like Korea, Manchuria, and others, but especially Manchuria. And then we come to 1905 when there is a war between Russia and Japan called the Russo-Japanese War. This was a war in which most Western observers assumed that Russia would win because there was so much racism at the time. It was assumed by white Europeans that no Asian power could go toe-to-toe with a European power. With no Asiatic people could go against a group of white people, for lack of a better word. That's just the way people thought back then. However, everybody was shocked when Japan completely crushed Russia. It was a devastating defeat. Japan, one thing they did was at the Battle of Tsushima, they completely destroyed the Russian fleet. So we already see Japanese naval excellence as early as 1905. And after this, Japan occupied Korea, and they declared it a Japanese protectorate. 5 years later, 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea. So Korea becomes part of the Japanese Empire. Then the Treaty of Portsmouth, which ended the Russo-Japanese War. I should say in passing, it was negotiated by Theodore Roosevelt.
Won a Nobel Peace Prize, did he not?
He did. First American ever. Some people think Einstein was the first American to get a Nobel Prize, but it was actually Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, of course. Anyway, so in this treaty, Japan was awarded southern Sakhalin Island. Now let's go forward a little bit further. In World War I, 1914 to 1918, Japan fought on the side of the Allies. That's kind of interesting. A lot of people don't know that Japan was actually in World War I and they were on the side of Britain and France and America and Russia. And after the war was over, Japan was awarded several former German colonies, and these included the Marshall Islands, the Marianas Islands, and the Caroline Islands in the South Pacific, and also the Chinese city of Shandong. Now, all of those islands are going to be a big part of our story. We'll be talking about all of them eventually. The Marshalls, Marianas, and the Carolines, they're going to become the bedrock of the Japanese Central and Southern Pacific fortress, if you will, the line of defense. And we're going to see later that the Americans are going to fight really hard to get those back, or not get them back, I should say, because they didn't own them, but to take them. Okay, then finally, after the end of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles formally recognized the Japanese occupation of former German colonies in Micronesia, north of the equator. And a League of Nations mandate put them under the Japanese administration known as the South Seas Mandate. So we see here that Japan made out pretty good in World War I, wouldn't you say, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, they're growing. They're becoming